The Kiev regime has turned to terrorist activity similar to the banned ISIS and Al-Qaeda. First of all, this is due to the apparent failure of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, which is generously sponsored by the United States, by the Great Britain and by other NATO countries. On July 17, an attack was carried out on the Crimean Bridge. On July 24, 2 Ukrainian drones tried to hit targets in Moscow. 17 drones tried to attack targets in Crimea. These attempts were successfully repulsed by the Russian air defense forces and electronic warfare. Thank God, there were no casualties. Earlier, on July 20, a Ukrainian drone attacked the village of Razdolnoye in Crimea. Unfortunately, there were some losses. A 14-year-old girl, a student of the 8th grade, died. Residents of Crimea mourn and bring flowers to a spontaneous memorial in the center of the village, in memory of the deceased child. The Zelensky regime does not hesitate to publicly take responsibility for acts of a terrorist nature, since it is confident that there will be no condemnation from the so-called civilized Western world. I will give you one quote. The head of the Ministry of Digitalization of Ukraine, Mikhail Albertovich Fedorov, not only confirmed Kyiv's involvement in attacks by unmanned aerial vehicles on Crimea and Moscow, but also promised that they would continue and their number would grow. You know, I have a question for the Americans. Moreover, this question is not for the State Department or the White House, but simply for ordinary Americans. Have you forgotten the terrorist attacks in Manhattan? You call them 9/11, September 11, 2001. Let me remind you, in case someone in America forgot, that it was 2 planes that crashed into buildings. These were the buildings of business centers in the United States of America. By and large, they were symbols of American economic power, the financial sector. After that, the United States of America generally revised its international policy. Moreover, several operations have been launched abroad to prevent the possibility of such attacks on their territory. Let me remind you of the words of the President of the United States of America, George Walker Bush. He said that this attack on the United States literally qualified as a declaration of war on Washington. Many years later, over the years, the international community has rallied in its rejection of international terrorism. Moreover, the Russian Federation was literally the first to extend a helping hand to the United States of America and provided the necessary assistance in the fight against terrorism. So, I have a question for ordinary Americans. What is the difference between unmanned vehicles that are sent to residential buildings, office centers, civilian infrastructure facilities from what the Americans went through in 2001? Is the difference in scale? Do you need scale? Are you waiting for this? Or will you still return to the basic ideas that there can be no justification for international terrorism, let alone support? I will remind ordinary Americans that everything that is happening right now, I mean these terrorist drone attacks on civilian infrastructure, that the Kiev regime is carrying out, is all paid for by the United States of America and Britain, 2 allies. But, in fact, it is paid by Washington and London from the pockets of their taxpayers. The peoples of the United States of America and Britain must understand that they are unwittingly drawn into a situation where they become, if not directly, but indirectly, the sponsor of international terrorism. All these crimes are thoroughly investigated by the Investigative Committee of Russia. The perpetrators will definitely be identified and punished. We reserve the right to retaliate. The Kiev regime began to actively use US-supplied cluster munitions on the battlefield. On July 22, a civilian car with journalists was fired at with this type of weapon. RIA Novosti war correspondent Rostislav Zhuravlev died. 4 of his colleagues received injuries of varying severity. According to the governor of the Belgorod region Vyacheslav Gladkov, cluster munitions were used by Ukraine on Saturday during the shelling of the village of Zhuravlyavka. In one morning, Ukraine launched 21 artillery shells, 3 cluster munitions from multiple launch rocket systems, and a kamikaze drone and a grenade launcher at this peaceful settlement in the Belgorod region. Earlier, the international community, politicians from dozens of countries, representatives of relevant organizations called for not supplying cluster munitions to the Kiev regime and not using them in Ukraine. They emphasized that such actions would be a violation of humanitarian norms. However, apparently, no exhortations are able to reason with the Ukrainian fascists and their Washington and London curators. The only thing that can stop these crimes is our tough and adequate response. Let me remind you that in the same way, the international community was horrified by the plans of the United States of America, Britain and their satellites to attack Iraq at the right time. I remember very well how the international community published open letters, built human chains, just to prevent the crimes of the United States of America. Washington didn't care. They did what they did. We understand perfectly well what Washington is doing now. This story was planned by them for a long time, and it is now being implemented on a large scale. And it seems to me that this scale, if you look at the amount of money that is allocated to the Kiev regime so that it, being an instrument in the hands of Washington, implements American aggressive intentions towards our country, I think that this scale is unprecedented in terms of the amount of money and the amount of military assistance and the material base and, of course,